do you feel about that today? Do you feel that Joe Biden let you down? And do you feel you got played by Joe Manchin?
No and no. I was on the phone with Senator Schumer today, with the White House, and I believe we will still get it done. It's going to be rocky, and we just have to continue to leave no space in the commitment to getting it done. And listen, the president's word is on the line here, and I do still believe that he is going to do what he told me and what he told our caucus and what he told the country he would do. Had we not done what we had done, though,
and if he doesn't, Congresswoman,
what was that?
And if he doesn't,
I cannot vote to continue with this piece of legislation. I just can't. I've tried everything humanly possible. I can't get there.
You're done. This is a no.
This is a no.
What's left of a nation so torn, being played against each other from the day that we're born? What's left of a country stripped bare by greedy corporations and rapacious billionaires? What's left once the vultures are through? Will there even be a country left for me and you? What's left once the fantasy fades and there's nothing but reality to smack us in the face? What's left are a people in pain, abandoned by their government and struggling to maintain. What's left is a nation enraged, with more and more becoming disillusioned each day. I'm left, and I'm here to stay, to make you feel uncomfortable and show you a better way. I'm left, but I'm not alone. There's millions more just like me, and not one will they own. We're the left, and we won't be ignored. The masses have been ignited, so brace for the storm. I said we're left, and we won't be ignored. The masses are ignited, better brace for the storm.
Surprise, surprise. Shocking nobody, the Build Back Better bill that the Democrats never actually wanted to pass to begin with has died on the floor of the Senate, thanks to the rotating villain of the moment, Joe Manchin. But hey, at least they got to waste over half a year of their precious time in power without actually accomplishing anything. Of course, with the notable exception of passing the bipartisan bill that will privatize any infrastructure corporations believe they can milk for a profit. Please watch Build Back Better BS Part 2, the Privatize Everything bill, if you would like to learn more. And very soon, it'll be time to focus on the slaughter that'll become the 2022 midterms. So the Democrats should have their news cycle set until they relievedly lose power next year, meaning mission accomplished. They are now on track to successfully manage their 2 years in power without doing anything their corporate donors wouldn't want. Or to put it another way, without doing anything that the American people desperately need. Because, as I laid out in part 1 of this series, there will always be just enough obstruction to stop any popular progressive policies from being passed into law. Because the Democrats don't actually want to win. They are much more comfortable lobbing criticisms from the outside and giving people false hope than they are with actually delivering on their campaign promises. As I mentioned at the top, this time around it was Senator Joe Manchin who was the meanie responsible for dashing the Democrats' dreams of finally fulfilling some of their promises. Or so the tale goes. As far as his reasoning, apparently Manchin astutely realized that we couldn't simply give struggling parents money to ensure they're able to feed, clothe, and house their children. Because they'd obviously just use the money to buy drugs and abuse the paid family leave to go on hunting trips. But mainly he was just really concerned about his already cash-strapped constituents and the effects that all this pie-in-the-sky policy would have on the economy. Policies, of course, that are in actuality very mild and incredibly popular regardless of party affiliation, and many would argue are the bare minimum the richest country in the world could provide for its people, especially during a pandemic. Not to mention that much of the world already takes them for granted. But nonetheless, there is nothing that can be done, considering that even the threat of spending public funds on, God forbid, the public has caused the inflation monster to run rampant. At least according to every talking head, business insider, and conservative politician with access to a microphone.
You pay people to stay home. You inflect more money into the economy from government, which only drives up inflation.
Nonsense. Inflation is a real concern that needs to be addressed, especially considering that a staggering 70% of all American households live on less than $40,000 a year. But the reasons given for it are at best misleading and at worst straight up corporate propaganda. Propaganda I intend to thoroughly dispel by the end of this video, starting by addressing the actual causes of this current bout of inflation, which economics professor Michael Hudson does a great job of laying out in this interview conducted by Ben Norton of The Gray Zone.
There are a number of reasons why prices have gone up. The big reason is if you look at the prices that have gone up, they're monopoly prices. The monopolies have been able to charge more because they're monopolies, and because there's less and less competition, and because the government is not really enforcing anti-monopoly legislation. Also, there are a lot of bottlenecks in transportation, as you've heard. There are two kinds of bottlenecks. One, you've heard about the port in Los Angeles over the ships. The shipping costs have tripled from Asia to the United States. The ships are unable to download because the ports are not organized as ports. It's not designed by anybody who's competently put there. The other fact is that companies, there's a new management philosophy that's come in maybe about 15 years ago, and that's called just-in-time inventory. In other words, the idea is you want to cut, the less you spend on inventories, the more money you have to pay out as dividends to your stockholders. If you don't have to spend money on inventories, then your profit rates go up and you can pay more. And so the company said, let's operate with almost no inventories at all. So a little bit of shortage all of a sudden caused a massive scramble to try to get enough goods to sell to people. And so those are the real reasons of inflation.
So basically, the very companies currently raking in record profits are the same ones responsible for the recent rise of inflation. And since virtually every market in America is controlled by at most a handful of companies who all have the same goal, there is no one to make them pay for jacking up prices. So customers have no choice but to pay the new exorbitant prices of essential goods. And even the initial supply chain issues that sparked this inferno were ultimately caused by the corporate class itself. Since they insist on doing business as cheaply as possible, we end up with research and development being done in places like the US and Europe, while parts are made in any number of countries, and manufacturing is outsourced to China, Bangladesh, and elsewhere, which works out great for everyone, of course, except for the workers, if everything runs smoothly. But once there's a little hiccup in the chain, the whole system can come to a grinding halt. And since the same corporate class also funds and props up what passes for a press in this country, the media will complain about inflation all day without ever even mentioning the root causes, although sometimes the truth slips through.
Here's a clip from one of the people who has control over prices, John Katsamatidis, president of Gristides and D'Agostino supermarkets. He's also a real estate and oil CEO.
You know how CEOs are on Wall Street. They live quarter by quarter. If they're off by a penny in earnings, Wall Street is not forgiven. So what are the CEOs doing? They're raising prices. I see food prices going up. Promotions are down to zero. Why give away something when you don't have to give it away and you make more margin?
That's a confession.
Why give away something when you don't have to give it away and you make more margin?
Business leaders are admitting that corporations are using the narrative of hyperinflation as an excuse to raise prices on you and increase profits for themselves. Let's look at some corporate earnings calls. This is a clip from the 2021 third quarter earnings of Tyson, the meat processor whose chicken you might have in your freezer.
We have increased prices to help offset significant raw material and supply chain cost inflation. Pricing's improved nearly 16% in the quarter versus the comparable period last year.
Some quick business talk translation. When he says pricing improved, he means Tyson was happy to raise prices, and that was good news for Tyson shareholders. Tyson's wants people like you and me to believe that they were forced to raise prices as a result of inflation. But the company is making almost double what it made the year before. Inflation gave them the excuse they needed to raise prices and reap record profits. Mondelez, the giant multinational food corporation that makes everything from Oreos Double Stuff and Not, to Hall's Cough Drops, to Philadelphia Cream Cheese, plans to raise prices by 7% in 2022, despite a record $1.08 billion in profits in the second quarter of 2021. That's double the profits of the year before. Corporations are seizing the opportunity to engage in massive profiteering because they can. They want to report higher profits to their investors so their stock prices go higher. They don't care, you have to pay more for your groceries.
And if you're still not convinced that the bulk of inflation is directly caused by the corporate class itself, maybe this clip of Senator Warren quizzing the current chairman of the Fed, Jerome Powell, on this very issue will help to alleviate those doubts.
If you're a corporation that has eaten up most of the competition and cornered the market, is it easier for you to raise prices on your customers and maximize your profits because you don't have to worry about losing your business? In other words, you've lost the discipline that the market imposes.
In principle, if you don't have competition and you're a monopolist, yes, you can raise your prices.
Okay, and over the past year, we know that prices have risen because of supply chain problems, unexpected shifts in the demand for goods, and even higher labor costs. But if corporations were simply passing along these costs in highly competitive markets, would the company's profit margins have changed much?
You know, so many things affect those that calculation. In principle, you could be right, but
well, it's very much not what we're seeing right now. Today, nearly 2 out of 3 of the biggest publicly traded corporations in the country are reporting fatter profit margins than they reported before the pandemic, which doesn't sound like they're just passing along costs. So let me ask you, does that increase in profit margins combined with greater market concentration in industry after industry suggest to you that some corporations may be passing along increased costs and at the same time charging more on top of that to fatten their profit margins?
that could be right. It could also just be, though, that demand is incredibly strong, and that you know, they're raising prices because they can.
Well, that's the point. They're raising prices because they can, and they're not being competed down.
And this is not some fluke or a sign of a broken system. Unfortunately, this system is working exactly as designed, which, if you ask me, is the problem. For whether we're talking about healthcare, food processing plants, or consumer goods, the goal is always the same: to maximize profits when and wherever possible. Meaning at any point companies believe they can get away with raising prices, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to do so. And if they choose not to, they will soon be replaced by someone who will. And notice, the most impactful forms of inflation are conveniently left out of the discussion altogether, specifically in regards to healthcare, housing, and education, areas where costs have been skyrocketing for decades, irrespective of the pandemic. Ever-increasing costs that keep most Americans barely above water, if at all. Yet nobody seems overly concerned with tackling these incredibly crippling areas of inflation. Why? Because it's in their best interest not to. Because our healthcare system is controlled by mafia middlemen who are only concerned with the profit motive, and unchecked pharmaceutical companies that can literally charge whatever they wish for their drugs with no restrictions. Drugs that are almost always researched, developed, and tested with public funds. The Build Back Better bill initially sought to address this insane practice, which is probably a main reason why it never passed. While higher education and education in general has not so slowly morphed from an important public investment in our collective future into just another product to be commodified. So much so that tuition costs are up nearly 1,200% from where they were in 1980. Not to mention the birth of the for-profit scam schools, including my old alum ITT Tech. As for housing, this is one area of inflation that actually is being caused by too much money flooding the market. As large private investment firms overpay for real estate in their bid to push out prospective homeowners by artificially raising housing prices as they seek to turn America into a nation of compliant, independent renters. As Michael Hudson explains in this same interview I cited earlier.
It's not a monetary inflation, except for the financial inflation of housing prices and the fact that it's created so many multi-billionaires by the Fed's quantitative easing that they've all created buyout, private capital buyout funds, and they're buying up all the housing and outbidding the owner-occupants that want to buy housing to take over the housing, turn it into rental housing, and charge cutthroat rents to the economy.
So instead of having robust and thoughtful conversations about how best to tackle these crushing forms of inflation, we're subjected to bad faith arguments about how the meager and insufficient crumbs given out during the pandemic are the sole cause of inflation, without ever getting into the details or even acknowledging the underlying and long-standing systemic factors contributing to it. But for the sake of argument, let's say they're right, that there's just too much money floating around out there. Wouldn't it make more sense to solve this problem by taking it from the hoarders known as the 1%? The people who have been siphoning as much money as they possibly can from the lower and middle classes at a rate of roughly $2.5 trillion with a T per year, totaling an incomprehensible $50 trillion over the past 40 plus years, leading to the 1% holding more wealth than the entire middle class combined. Or how about cutting into our military's grotesque and out-of-control budget? A budget that they admit they cannot account for, and one that's bigger than the next 11 countries combined, many of which being our allies. Incidentally, last month, as the Build Back Better bill was lying on its deathbed, the House and later the Senate were somehow able to easily pass a $30-some billion increase to the Pentagon's already bloated yearly budget. One that now totals $768 billion, which is actually $25 billion more than what was even requested, all with no debate nor nary a peep of concern about inflationary impact. And of course, without any input at all from the American people themselves. Funny how that happens. And it wasn't just the so-called blue dog Democrats who voted alongside the GOP. More than half the so-called progressive caucus joined in on the gross largesse. A largesse that, of course, doesn't include the black budgets, so who knows what the real total is. But even with the total given, it far outweighs the amount of money spent in the three areas that desperately need more spending: healthcare, housing, and education, and utterly dwarfs the supposedly progressive agenda of the Biden administration for the next 10 years to come. And remember, this is all after the end of the U.S.'s longest and most costly war, where we spent an average of $300 million a day for 20 years. In-fucking-sane. Then there's the yearly subsidies and frequent bailouts big businesses can always count on, like the billions of dollars that go to big tech companies, including those owned by the world's richest men, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, with, again, absolutely no debate nor input from the American public. The billions given to fossil fuel companies so that they can continue to make a profit, even though if we were to include the exorbitant cost of externalities caused by the procurement and use of these resources, $5.9 trillion according to a new study out of the International Monetary Fund, they wouldn't be able to make a dime. Then there's the negligently reported $9 trillion received by Wall Street, with just 3 banks, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, and Citigroup receiving half of that total via the Fed's repo loan program, just prior to the outbreak of the pandemic, almost as if we were in financial trouble well before the virus was even known. Yet I haven't seen a word spoken about this in the mainstream. And that's to say nothing of the $4.5 trillion Wall Street received just a few months later via the CARES Act, all of which I covered at the time, and you can check out in these 2 videos linked here. Yet, somehow, all of this inflation is the fault of the survival checks and meager raises in hourly wages. Raises mainly due to the pseudo-general strike that has resulted from the lockdowns and from people just simply reaching their limit, like the brave workers at Frito-Lay, Kellogg's, John Deere, and elsewhere. But even those modest increases on average have not kept up with inflation. Then there's the fact that wages have been stagnant for over 45 years. So much so that a study conducted in 2015 showed that with all things being equal, the average hourly worker in 2014 actually made less than their 1973 counterpart. That staggering stat, coupled with the fact that the cost of living has more than doubled over the same period, means we should be spending more on the people and in public infrastructure, not less.
It's the fiscal authority that has this, the capacity to tame the actual sources of the pandemic disruptions and to tame the actual sources of abusive market power And you do that by spending more, not by spending less. This is really the counterintuitive thing that most people are not able to handle. If you spend, let's say, I'm just going to make up a number here. If you spend, let's say, $1 trillion on Build Back Better, you create millions of jobs, you pay people decent wages, they go out on a shopping spree like it's a free country, right? The problem is that increase in spending by those workers that we've hired to build back better is going to ripple through the system. We're going to have more demand for cars, more demand for housing, more demand for health, more demand for entertainment. And if our economy has those two components that I talked about earlier, shortages in these key areas in health and transportation and housing, and if we have abusive market power in these markets, then the $1 trillion that we spent on Build Back Better is going to actually feed the inflation machine. But if we spend 2 or 3 trillion on Build Back Better, and we tax and regulate abusive market power in the inflation pressure points where we know this market power exists, then spending more creates more jobs, builds more productive capacity in areas where we have shortages, such as health or transportation, logistics, housing, affordable housing. By increasing the capacity, you tame the inflation pressure points. And by taxing and regulating abusive price setters in these markets, you eliminate the source of abusive inflation pressure. So it turns out spending more with the right targeting mechanism and taxing abusive market power, democratizing the economy, is actually not inflationary. That's your best inflation targeting policy.
So yes, certain types of spending can be inflationary, but it can be offset by ensuring we have enough production capacity to meet the increase in demand and price controls in place to forestall the corporate class from exploiting it. Excessive inflation is not some act of nature. It's a byproduct of our irresponsibility, and in this case, mainly driven by corporate greed. It's past time we stop pretending like we're helpless slaves to the will of the market and finally put the economy to work for us as a whole, instead of only for a select few. And lastly, I would just like to drive home the point that, with the notable exception of Kshama Sawant in Seattle, the working class has zero representation in public office. The Democrats are not our friends, and at the very least are not overly concerned with winning, because they know as long as they're dutiful servants to corporate interests, they will be handsomely rewarded with lucrative lobbying and consulting gigs, not to mention the exorbitant speaking fees they stand to rake in. Which is why there will always be just enough obstruction to forestall any meaningful change. Hell, any moderate or even mild change. Their only concern is the same as the Republicans: to implement the will of the donor class. The same donor class that sponsors and controls both political parties in this theater play we call a democracy. The division is only for show. Don't believe me? Just take a look at the 2014 Princeton study that shows, quote, "The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy." Meaning the number of average Americans who want a particular policy, say Medicare for all, has a negligible impact on whether it will pass or not. While, on the other hand, if the ruling elite and special interests overwhelmingly want or do not want it to pass, they're astronomically more likely to get their way. Or in other words, we do not live in a democracy. We live in a rapacious oligarchy. The system is the problem. And until we first acknowledge this fact and then finally come together to adequately address it, nothing will fundamentally change. And even though that is the single solitary campaign promise kept by the Biden administration, it won't stop right-wingers like Newt Gingrich and Hillary Clinton from pinning the recent rash of inflation as well as the upcoming slaughter in the midterms and anything else they can think of squarely on the shoulders of the left, blaming the very tepid and basic policy prescriptions that won the Democrats control of the White House and Congress and have since gone completely ignored. Don't let them. Demand more. Demand better. Demand a system that is not completely built on the endless exploitation of the many for the sole purpose of enriching a tiny number of already obscenely rich assholes. There are some real substantive and substantial differences between right-leaning and left-leaning Americans. But until we address the class war that we have been collectively losing for the past 40+ years, those differences are little more than wedges used to keep us distracted and fighting amongst ourselves. to stop us from realizing that if we ever did come together, we'd actually have the power to force meaningful and long-lasting change. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you appreciate this type of content. And remember, other poor people are not the problem. Jana.
We love and respect the hardworking people of this country, although I'm pretty sure they don't always feel the love.
First of all, my age, I'm gonna, I need health care for a surgery if it comes up.
I need assistance to pay my rent.
After 25 and a half years, I make $8.99 an hour.
The student loans will probably delay me ever buying a house with my fiance.
I dropped out of college. I had to. I couldn't afford it. My mother couldn't afford it.
I don't get paid maternity leave.
I work 7 days a week.
Now I can't afford to retire because of health care.
I need child care like I need my next breath.
I have 2 degrees. I have student loans and bachelor's degrees and 14 years experience. I should not have to come ask for food.
I'm living paycheck to paycheck. If I live in a country that says it's number one, why do I feel like, I'm at the bottom of the barrel?
See, it turns out that hardworking Americans aren't doing that great. Anybody know what might help them?
Single-payer health care, government-paid child care,
free college, government healthy food, early education, child education, universal child care,
guaranteed job for everyone with a family-sustaining wage, adequate family and medical leave, paid vacations and retirement security.
You guys are dead on. Man, that is totally unexpected. But you all are dead on right. That is exactly what we need to do in this country. But I sensed a tone in your voice. Why aren't we doing those things?
If that's not socialism, I'm not sure what is.
Every socialist wish list item.
Socialist and globalist wish list. Socialist fantasy.
Paradise for all.
Right. So there it is. We cannot give our hard-working, leather-behanded heroes their basic needs because that's socialism. And thus, the problem with the economy. Now, if you've ever listened to AM radio in your uncle's van, you know, socialism, not good.
The moment America becomes a socialist country is the moment that America ceases to be America.
The United Socialist States of America.
Job-killing, soul-crushing socialist agenda.
I mean, hello, Venezuela.
They want to take your pickup truck.
They want your money. And if you won't give it to them, they'll take it.
They want to rebuild your home.
Socialism destroys. Socialism kills.
People really die.
It's despair, destruction. It's starvation, poverty, squalor, chaos, death, 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 death.
They want to take away your hamburgers.
So we know that socialism is evil. But if you would indulge me for just a moment, why is it evil again?
Is socialism a fair system?
Oh, not at all. Because what does socialism do? It allows the government to choose winners and losers. And that is one of the things that we as conservatives fight against. We want a level playing field.
So socialism is bad because it's the government picking the winners and losers. And there's nothing worse than that. Not spiders with wings, not grandma titty punching. There's nothing worse. Basically saying if you're a loser, it's your fault. And government stepping in is socialism. Get your shit together and keep Uncle Sam's sweet teats out of your dirty fucking loser mouth. Uncle Sam wants you to leave these bad boys alone. There's only one problem with this. And that is government picks winners and losers all the time.
The White House gives an early Christmas present to Detroit's automakers, a $17 billion loan.
The airline industry has gotten a $50 billion lifeline.
$23 million incentive package for Amazon.
JP Morgan Chase got $25 billion.
Chrysler got some $7 billion.
$700 billion of your taxpayer money to Wall Street big banks.
The tuna company, StarKist Plus, gets a $62 million tax credit.
Wisconsin is giving Foxconn $3 billion.
The state offered more than $845 million for Apple to build right where I'm standing right now.